Hi everyone, welcome to this live that I'm doing with Daniel Maté. So let me just wait for him to come on. We're going to be talking about the relationship between spirituality and politics and political activism. So definitely come on with your questions and such. And yeah, I'll also share some upcoming offerings and ways to deepen your spiritual practice. So let me see where Daniel is. Okay, hi everybody, welcome. Yes. Hi Dan.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
um, well, welcome everybody. Feel welcome to say where you're calling from, what questions you have,
It's been
and
a while since we did this, huh?
I know you haven't been as you used to do so many lives all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't been online as much, at least not on this app.
Yeah.
I, it, uh, I guess we could talk about that, but here we are. Glad to be doing this with you.
Yeah, totally. Um, Bed-Stuy. We got some Bed-Stuy people. Dubai. It's always so nice to see where people are calling from.
Especially when it rhymes from Bed-Stuy to Dubai.
Yeah. Um, cool. Is there anything you want to share before we get started?
No, just yeah. No, here we are. Let's go.
Okay. Great. Well, I was just saying to everybody that we wanted to do this live to talk about the relationship between spirituality and political activism,
Hmm.
which is a conversation that's been really dear to my heart and something that I've been constantly navigating and negotiating around how to bridge these worlds because I think they're fundamentally the same world, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but so often they feel very segregated from one another.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, so that invites a whole range of follow-up questions, which is, did you just say you see them as the same thing, or you see them as kind of inextricably linked, or
I see them as fundamentally the same thing.
fundamental? Okay, so let me just maybe I'll just go ahead and ask how so.
Well, I think political activism fundamentally says that the world as we see it is unjust. It's not working. It's, um, yeah, not allowing for people to be well, right? And even if you hold, oh, well, some people are profiting from this genocide, like that's actually not wellness, right? That's still sickness. So political activism comes from this place of this something is unjust, something is unfair, something's not working. There's a lot of human pain. Systems need to shift. Systems need to be dismantled. They need to be reworked, re-understood. And to me, spirituality provides the tools as to how to do that.
Hmm,
Uh, right? Like politics, in some ways, maybe identifies the problem, but spirituality gives the path. Um,
hmm.
and it's quite interesting because something I've been reflecting on a lot is this word liberation, which is actually used in both worlds quite often, right?
Right.
When we talk about spirituality, I mean, sometimes people call it enlightenment or whatever, but they use the word liberation quite a lot. And in political work, people also use that word liberation. And I think when people use it in different worlds, they maybe mean different things, but ultimately, I believe they are the same meaning.
Hmm. So, the idea would be that to attain one would um, necessarily draw on or make the other kind of urgently. Well, let me ask you this. Let me put it this way, because people, you can say they're one and the same, but we certainly are living in a world that keeps up the appearances that one can be done without the other,
Yeah,
and that you could probably even find arguments. I'm sure I could come up with some that would say, well, you can try to blend them, but some people who try to do both end up defanging each one. That
sure.
if you get to and this is probably based on stereotypical views of either political activism or of spirituality, but I can imagine, well, the whole danger of spiritual bypass, for instance, which maybe we
Mhm.
should address as a separate question later on. But we get to a place where everything is like, I don't know if you've read A Course in Miracles, but
Yeah,
there's a point of view, there's a level at which you can say there is no oppression, there is no war, there is no genocide. It's all illusion. God doesn't recognize these human um, suffering realms, and that if we can just get beyond the view, and I can imagine a political activist saying, well, if you use God or spirituality to try and close your eyes to what's going on, well, we can't use you in the movement. Sorry, that's not
yeah,
helpful.
yeah, yeah,
And I can imagine a spiritual person being like, we don't talk politics here because we're trying to bring, I don't know, universal consciousness, and it's just
yeah,
too divisive, and that's ordinary human mind. Not gonna. So you can imagine these
yeah,
are all the ways in which this, what I guess you would call an artificial segregation between the two, plays itself out. But maybe we could get at it this way. What is missing from political activism when spirituality is not in the room? And what is missing from spirituality when political consciousness and awareness and a willingness and desire to do something about the material world we live in, aka politics,
yeah,
is not in the room? What do they need from each other?
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I can start first by just sharing a little bit more personally, as maybe like a doorway to some of these questions. But yeah, I was born in Jerusalem, and when I was 10, moved to the US. And um, I think for me, like I got politicized fairly young. Like when I was 18 or 19, I started becoming part of different political movements, whether, learning about Occupy struggle that was happening, and of course, apartheid that was happening also back home. Um, or, of course, feminism, gender rights, civil rights,
Hmm.
racism, like all of these, like anti-blackness. Like I started just getting really involved in a lot of different movements and struggles. Um, and yeah, I think when I was like 24, 25, I just got really burnt out. I just couldn't do any of it anymore. That's actually when I moved. Well, I guess I was maybe younger. 23 is when I moved to the Bay. But I just felt like in my body, I just really deeply needed rest. Like I just couldn't keep fighting, and I think that there's something also so interesting about how, fighting is in some ways the premise of political activism, is that we're fighting systems of oppression. But then fighting can sometimes also be a trauma response where we're just constantly fighting. And I
Hmm.
think that there was this pattern that I recognized in myself, that I was just constantly fighting. And I wanted to know a world of that I could just lay on the grass and connect to earth. And that's for me when a lot of the journey around somatic healing, somatic experiencing kind of began, of recognizing that my body has wisdom, but is also sending me signals all the time that I've just been taught to override because I have this intellectual analysis of what I should be doing.
Hmm.
Um, and because the times are so urgent, and, lots of different um, reasons for it all. But yeah, and that's also when I started meditating more and finding different spiritual practices. Um, Actually, the way that I came to spirituality was at an event that was, yeah, about the activism of Black Panthers. And they actually, there were activists there that talked about meditation as a principle for fighting police brutality and all of a sudden I was like getting exposed to these tools and techniques and witnessing that like as things are happening outside, there's also things that are happening inside of me. And anyways, I just came to this fundamental question that I feel politics never fully addressed, which is, okay, we want to like shift these systems of oppression, but what do we do with this endless amount of human pain that there is? Like, I actually found that a lot of times in activist space, even though we're fighting so hard against these systems of oppression, we oftentimes lack the tools to be with pain, whether it's each
Mm.
other's or ourselves or the collective's pain. So it started feeling like this contradiction for me of like, we're fighting for this better world, but at the same time, we don't know how to be with someone who's suffering, you know?
Mm.
And we don't know how to, like, we're saying the system is fucked, the system needs to change, but there's kind of this inability to recognize the impact that the system has on people and what it actually takes for that journey to heal and to be present with it all. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but yeah.
Right. And so if you're going to do political work, which means to struggle, I mean, unless you're in the situation where your particular circumstances force you to fight or die, like,
Yeah.
you know, fight to survive, that's not the kind of political work we're necessarily talking about here. To be born into Gaza is to be, to have no choice but to be in a political situation, and your life is, you know, living is political and all that. But if you're going to be lending your solidarity and your activism by choice to the struggles of others, or uh, or of a broader community, it sounds like you're saying there's a skill required, which is the ability to be with people's pain, because that pain is not going to disappear the minute you say I'm signing up for the struggle. Like,
Yeah.
if you're in it, if you're in the fight, you're in the being with that pain probably for a long, long time. And the root of the word compassion is compassion, to feel with. So you're talking about the rudiments of the skill of compassion that you're saying. So what does spirituality have to teach us about how to practice that skill?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely.
Like, couldn't I learn that skill without reference to God or creation or anything like that? Like, what? Sell me. Don't sell me, but tell me what you see. What do you see as spirituality? And maybe this is where we need to get you to kind of define what you're talking about, because you have a spiritual school, right, called malchut, which has various offerings, which I know we're going to speak about. But yeah, what is that domain of spirituality, and what are the parameters of it, and what does it have to do with learning compassion?
Yeah. Well, can I first ask you something?
Yeah.
If you think back, I don't know, whatever moment that comes up for you around an experience of being with pain, whether it was your own or someone else's,
Hmm.
what what was helpful or valuable around that experience? Like, how did you find a way to be with it?
Hmm. Well, the example that comes to mind is very convenient for your message, because it involves me singing a Hebrew prayer to myself, weeping to console myself at a moment when I was actually in jail in Mexico. I was in an immigration detention center for 3.5 weeks. I overstayed my tourist visa, and they caught me. And it was the high holidays, and my sister managed to smuggle in some, um, uh, prayer materials into some letters that were actually, that was how she got the letters to me, because it was religious texts, right? They had to allow it in, but they didn't check to see that a bunch of friends had also written me letters. Anyway, I found myself holding these Hebrew prayers, and I hadn't been to synagogue in
Yeah.
probably years. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, And yet these melody, I knew these melodies, and I sort of knew what the words meant, you know. And there's a prayer called Avinu Malkeinu, which is our, I mean, technically it means our
Yeah.
father, our king, but you could say our parent, our patriarch, or our parent, our sovereign, um, pleading for mercy
Yeah.
and deliverance. And there was a part of me that was watching myself stand there with these prayers, and you know, there was a voice in my head being like, "This is ridiculous. Like now you choose to, now you're going to pray." You know, like, oh, good for you. Um, but something in me needed it so bad. I needed to connect with something more ancient and more enduring, I guess,
Hmm.
um, and something, yeah, transcendent. So
Yeah.
it actually really did help, and that, uh, I guess, yeah, compassion for myself, compassion for human suffering, my connection to everyone in the world
Yeah.
who, for that 3.5 week period, I happened to have in common that I was incarcerated. I knew it was going to be over soon, actually. That was another piece of it. I knew that they were not going to keep me there forever, and I was going to lose that commonality with people. I was going to go back to my privileged life.
Yeah.
So, anyway, yeah, that was a moment with that.
That's interesting. I didn't plant this answer just so everybody knows.
Yeah, no,
I mean, well, so one thing that I heard from that is that um, part of what helped you was actually this connection to something that was bigger than you, actually.
yeah,
Like you had to actually have access to something that was larger than just you and your personal experience.
yeah.
Uh, which I would say, you're asking me to define spirituality. I mean, there's so many ways of defining it, but I think that's one of them, right? Is that when we understand that we, however we conceive ourselves to be, um, are not, we're not all that there is, right? There's actually something greater and something larger
Mm,
that we're in connection with. Um, and I actually think that when like that relationship is ruptured, when I don't feel connected to something bigger than myself, this is when a lot of personal suffering comes online,
mm,
right? Because I mean, and there's so many different ways that can happen, right? Either the ego gets inflated, and we know that actually creates self-harm to the system,
yeah.
or I could feel really isolated and alone and depressed to the point that I'm like just disconnected from reality as it is. Um, so I think, to me, I call it God, and we can talk about this word to unpack, but God could literally be substituted. I mean, every religion has many names for God. It's not just the G word. But this notion of something bigger than the you. And I think it's interesting because when you were talking about your experience, there was also something about being in this like narrow place, like
Hmm.
narrow and like desiring expanse, right?
And also a place where fighting was futile.
Yeah,
Like I had exhausted to get to that place. My psyche had to go through all of its protests, all of its woe is me, all of its how can I get out of this? How can I be special? How can I jump to the front of the line? I got COVID in there, which was an added thing. So I was quarantined, and
yeah,
so extra constrained. And but I watched my mind go through all of its tricks to try and fight, and I there was no escape. There was literally no escape.
yeah.
And so all that was left was a kind of deep longing for finding some way to be at home with myself.
Mm, yeah,
And I guess I had to find some gates in me that would open, that would let some air in, that were wider than future projections and hoping and nostalgia and all the other things the mind can do to, let's say, escape or depress. I had kind of tried depression too. I'd got, not tried it, not on purpose, but gotten very glum and feeling sorry for myself for a number of days. And yeah, the only thing that felt expansive was to, I guess, expand the view, and it just happened to coincide with Rosh Hashanah, so the prayer was right there for me.
Yeah, I love that notion of expanding the view. Um, wow, I was gonna say something, but I totally forgot.
Mm. Sorry, I should have. I'm getting to know that when you that look on your face when you have something to say, and then I keep talking and you lose it.
It's okay. I actually thought I had it and it just slipped. Um, yeah. Oh, I was gonna say in one of my first meditation retreats that I went on, um, I remember the teacher said something about how like when you're outside of the meditation retreat, you just look at the world and you like things annoy you, like that person annoys you and you get judgmental, or this thing doesn't, you don't like this thing or that, and you'll constantly have like commentary about how annoying the world is or people are or this or that, and then you come to meditation retreat and you realize like you're the annoying one. And like that's like part of like confronting your own mind, is realizing like that the annoyance actually wasn't coming from these other things that you thought it was, but it's actually something that's happening inside.
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, I always think about that moment because it's like such a, it's actually, it's, you know, it's such a small shift, but it's so profound to go from, oh, they're the annoying one, to actually, oh, I'm annoying, right? Like to actually see something in you that you actually see out there. And that's something that, you know, again, going back to kind of the definitions of spirituality, um, one being kind of something connecting you to this notion of larger than the self. But for me, the definition that I mean, I don't know exactly definition, but a perspective that feels important is that whatever is happening inside matters, right? That we're not just physical beings,
Mm.
we're not just this material beings who live and die, but actually there's something that is, you know, and this is where to me it intersects with a lot of psychology and psyche-based work, right? Because we have this psyche, we have, you could call it, I call it consciousness, but you could call it the mind, right? We have all of these things that are happening inside, like thoughts and emotions and intuitions and dreams, and it's actually a whole inner world that, you know, to me sometimes in the modern world is just completely flattened, and we're just like, oh, I'm just this external person, but actually every human has so much inside that, you know, you could really just spend your life disconnecting from the outside world and just seeing what's inside, and you'll have more than enough data, you know, to spend the rest of your life unpacking. So yeah, that there's like this rich inner landscape that is not necessarily visible through the physical eye. You know, this is part of what I say a lot in my classes, is that, you know, what we want to sometimes turn off the physical eye and turn on the spiritual eye. So we are actually interested in um, like seeing reality with truth, and we can understand that the physical eyes that we have to see reality, even if we sometimes think that's like the realest thing and the most true thing, it actually, by definition, is not, right? Because the physical eyes are coming from a limited perspective that's like based on our personal conditioning, you know, all sorts of things, our psyche, our ego, or this, like it's actually quite a narrow lens, right? And if we build our whole world based on that narrow lens that we're seeing the world through, actually we'll find that we're producing a lot of pain for ourselves,
Mm.
because we're actually building stuff that's based on, I don't want to call it a lie, but incomplete realities. So to me, spirituality is about the study of truth, this, but that actually means the study of reality, you know, the study of what is actually happening, what is, you know, what is reality, and how can I see it clearly without getting in the way, as we so often do.
Mm.
I'm just gonna, there's so many like people who are calling us self-hating Jew. I'm just gonna,
No, there's really one person who's calling us self-hating Jews about 6,000 times. It's an interesting way to spend your day, to log into log into the live of two people whose views you despise and just break your thumbs screaming at them and calling them names. So what's the spiritual view of dealing with the comment section?
Um, I mean, first of
Because
all,
I'd like to say, oh, I can just ignore it, but they're doing what they want to
yeah,
do. They're distracting. Like I notice there's like I get a rise
yeah,
in my chest. I want to fight. I want to get sarcastic. Like I want to go at them. Like okay,
yeah,
let's do this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, you know, and they're cloaking themselves in like pride, proud Zionist. And at the same time, I'm like, no, just rise above it, just ignore it, so on and so forth.
What the hell?
Uh,
Do you see this thing? How did that happen?
I'm not sure how that happened.
What did happen? How do I take this off?
I don't know. This is why I'm not on Instagram anymore these days. I just find this is just so juvenile. What is that?
What? I don't know how to make it go away. What?
Oh,
Sorry.
it's now producer Adam Levin from the Bad Asbarat podcast is in the house. If you want to let loose, now that'll be some creative insults. I mean,
Yeah.
just that's a man I trust. That's an artist. That's an artist of the form.
Wait, this is
These random trolls.
super confusing me. Why does this, what is
I
happening here?
didn't put it there.
Why does it say I'm a 10?
But what's the joke? You're a 10 butt.
I think it's like one of those Instagram things that as you move it, it's supposed to go, but it's not actually. Huh. What do we do with this, Daniel?
I do not know. Is it at the bottom? Is it a filter at the bottom?
How do I know? This is the weirdest thing.
Shut off the filter at the right side of the screen.
How do I do that? How did this filter? Sorry, this is so annoying. Oh, there we go. There we
Ah,
go.
well done.
Okay, that was like really strange. Okay, no, we got it. But now it feels like it got brighter. Okay, sorry, I don't know where we got with that. Yeah, there was actually a couple people that I removed that were just like saying awful
Oh,
shit.
you know how to remove people? Good, because I guess because you're the host.
Yeah, I just removed a few people.
Yeah,
It was just like two or three. But yeah, it's like, well, I mean, first of all, you're asking like, what's the spiritual view? There is no the
there is
spiritual
no.
view.
Well, yeah, right.
I think that's part of what for me I'm trying to kind of bring into the world, that it's not like this is what spirituality says and this is what you need to do. It's more of like spirituality is a study that
Hmm.
actually in any given moment no one knows the answer to.
Yeah.
And there's different traditions, different techniques, but ultimately, this for me, I really relate to God as the mystery of reality. I think when we lose touch of this element of mystery, this element of the unknown, the element of I don't actually know how to relate to this thing, I don't actually know, like that to me is actually when we get off the spiritual path, right? Being on the spiritual path is constantly in this, and in more kind of religious traditional terms, is to understand that God is the infinite one, and that no matter what, you're actually never going to get it all. So that's kind of where the humility and the service work kind of comes in. Um, but yeah, so that's all to say that, like, to
Since
really see what the
I'm
spiritual view
sorry.
is.
I'm sorry.
What?
This guy, whoever this is, just won a response from me. You got it. You got me. Since when do progressives believe in God? Now, if you want to define progressives as people who are trying to make society progress towards more love, compassion, justice, and truth, well, I don't know. There was a guy named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. There was Martin Luther King. There was Mahatma Gandhi. There was Jesus. It's kind of just a classic thing that spirituality and wanting to make the world a better place,
Yeah.
they often go together. And yeah, there's a lot of secular progressives too. But I don't know. But see, what's the fucking point? Like, why am I even interacting with this clown?
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
like this guy.
but
I mean,
but
well,
as for and calling us Nazis, yeah, this is such a typical Nazi conversation. I mean, you log into any neo-Nazi website and you're just going to see a couple of Jews talking about the heart of truth and the love of God, and uh, yeah, I mean, 100%. Uh, the closest thing I've seen to anything truly Nazi today was a blog in the Times of Israel talking about how Israel needs Lebensraum to make room for for its exploding population. What's Lebensraum? That was Hitler's term, breathing room for breathing space. That's why he invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia. So basically saying Israel needs to expand its borders to make room for our ethno state. That, I mean, then they even used the word
yeah.
Lebensraum. That was a Zionist blog. So I don't know.
Well, I
You
was
can be
gonna
the judge
say,
of who the Nazi is.
yeah. I mean, I think like Zionist indoctrination is that the word?
Hmm.
Um, actually very much lines up with what we're saying, right? Because and that was part of my journey also, because I was raised under Israeli society, hearing all sorts of propaganda, and then after a while, you start realizing that everyone's just saying the same phrases over and over again, and it's not even connected to any question you ask them. It's just like, no land without people. Like it just like starts repeating in this like kind of psychotic way that's
Do these
not.
people do these people scream out "capo" when they orgasm? I mean, is it?
I don't know. Maybe we'll have to. You'll have to go on an experiment to find out.
I will not. I shall not. And I won't.
um, no, but like I think that you can see the level of disconnection that there is from reality as it is when you start seeing how people become kind of automated robots.
Yeah.
Like they're not actually relating to anything that's happening. I'm just like thinking like like they're just kind of regurgitating shit that's like not even clear what the purpose of it is. So you can see that they're just kind of stuck and not actually related to, I mean, this present moment, but also reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of just going back to like with the spiritual view of it, it's interesting because right before this live, I saw someone talk about when a lot of kind of negativity comes your way, whether it's like from comments or from trolls or from all these different things, right? I mean, it could mean, again, like with spirituality, it's like not one thing, it can mean multiple things, right? It could mean that you might want to look at something that you're putting out there, but it could also mean actually that you're providing a lot of, for lack of a better word, like light into the world or healing into the world. And actually, right, and this is like goes into a whole Kabbalistic, mystical thing, but like the way in which the emanation of light of God is always going to attract these negative forces that are trying to bring it down.
Hmm.
So sometimes when you kind of get a lot of negativity, it's like almost kind of this sign. Sometimes people say in this physical world around success, right? The more success you get, the more haters you have, and that's kind of sign that what you're doing is actually meaningful. Um,
You
so
have
I
to
think
be
that,
you have to be careful not to let the ego take over that one and be like, wow, since people are giving me all this negative feedback, I must be doing something really right. Well, you can imagine there's people in the world who could
yeah,
stand to listen to some, and I've been one of them sometimes,
yeah,
that you want to be looking at the actual impact of your actions on people and to say, is that aligned with what I'm preaching? Is that aligned with what I'm really up to? But
yeah,
if I just log on and say blah, and I get someone calling me names, then yeah, I'd be happy to say, okay, good, I must be spreading some light or something.
yeah. And that's why it's like it really depends on the context and the situation, right? That's why it's like spiritual teachings can never be generalized into like do this, because they're so context dependent, and
Yeah,
there's actually so many things that are happening at once that to really dissect a moment, like, this is why when people ask me like advice about like what I should like, and I'm sure you get this also with your mental chiropractic work. You're just like, there's no one way of thinking about things. You actually have to understand the situation. You have to you have more context as to what's happening in order to actually provide any sort of meaningful advice. Um, yeah, I feel like
Yeah,
we were in the middle of a good conversation before we got
yeah,
derailed.
we got a bit derailed, so that person did definitely achieve their purpose.
Yeah.
Let's go back to this question of what can a spiritual view add to the proceedings when we're trying to
Yeah.
make the world a better place? And how do we
Totally.
avoid spiritual bypass? How do we avoid kumbaya, like I see the God in everybody, and
Someone just made a pun. Oh, Deborah, when I made a pun, you got Israel for derail.
hey, Deborah, last night you were saying to me that you're a recovering punster.
And now we see the proof.
Now we see that you're back on the sauce. Welcome back. I knew
uh,
you couldn't resist.
um, yeah, actually, that's really funny. I like that. Israel for derailed. Um, yeah, okay, well, I'll say a couple of things. One, the first thing is, you know, if we're just talking about political activism, and, different people say it in different ways, that it's not enough to just fight against the system as it is. It's also necessary in some ways to articulate a vision of what you want. Because without that, it actually becomes a bit tough, because then you lose kind of your values over time, because you don't have like this north compass of, well, what's the vision, what's the purpose, what's the this, right? And even if the vision feels unattainable in today or tomorrow or even the next year or the next 10 years or even the next lifetime, which for a lot of things feels like that sometimes, it's like having that vision helps direct and organize. And I think without the vision, that's where a lot of infighting and movements happen, or where people just start kind of feeling like, well, what is this for? And just a shout out to these folks who I spoke with this week, when we're talking about Palestine, for example. There's this, I mean, I don't know what to call them, network organization that's called like the One Democratic State Initiative. That I find that in my activism really supportive, to have people who have really articulated a plan, a vision, as opposed to just saying, fuck this genocide, fuck this apartheid system, we want to dismantle it. Which, like, yes. And there's also like this importance of being like, okay, but what are we actually building towards? And I find that the more we articulate the vision, the more it actually becomes possible. So how do we articulate a vision, right? Especially when the world is so horrific and disastrous. To me, one of the ways, and this is where it comes back to the spiritual work, is that it's important to learn how to taste things or how to feel things before they become actualized. And this might get a little complex, but one of my views of the self, of thinking about like the self and who the self is, I often say that the self has 5 levels, right? The physical, the material body, there's the emotional, there's the mental, there's the energetic, and then there's the spiritual, which is the soul level. And that's actually detailing a creation process. And, lots of different traditions have similar, like Buddhism has the 4 kind of path, and Kabbalah has the 4 worlds. I like to think about it in these 5 categories, that it's like the soul kind of came off from the cosmic spiritual landscape, energy started forming, creating, the mental patterns started configuring, the emotions, which is the movement, started cycling, and then the body. So the body is actually, in some ways, the most completed version of creation. But there's what is called more subtle forms of creation that are constantly happening. So, something to just talk about in psychology terms, about thinking about the relationship between the mental state and the emotional state, right? We often find that emotions have stories, and stories have, like, there's a connection. And actually, when we change something on the mental level, it's easier for the emotion to shift and then for the body to shift with it, right? Or at least that's my view of it. And I mean, whatever we could talk about. And actually, I'm curious your thoughts about this in terms of all the different practices of like therapy that there is, of like whether you start with the body or you go to the mind, because a lot of your stuff is around, well, change your mental configuration to get unstuck, and then certain things will follow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, that's just to say that there's different places on the kind of subtle creation field that we can have these moments of intervention, of shifting things that can then lead to a shift in the material reality. And I think, sometimes people will call people who speak this way, it's like, oh, they're crazy people, they're just imagining things. Although I think the world, in terms of like the place of thoughts impacting behavior or thoughts impacting relation or whatever, like I think there's enough research about that these days. But just to say that I think that this, like, sometimes it just feels really overwhelming to change this material reality, because it's like, how the hell are we going to do it? And I think that if we think we can just change the material reality as human bodies that are just physical, we're a bit delusional. Like, how are we going to go up against these giant empires and military systems and all, and this is where, for me, I really resonate with so many movements across history, that part of like the political analysis that I inherited was that it's not just about fighting with your bodies, right, to resist, although of course that can be part of it, but it's also something about transforming the consciousness of the people and of reality, which is more subtle, right? You can't necessarily, there's not like a, oh yeah, we shifted consciousness and now we're right, but
Well, and even if you just want to take martial, like, never mind political movements, but just soldiers and armies and warriors, uh, it's long been understood that someone who is dying or fighting for a cause bigger than themselves is going to fight better
yeah,
than someone who's just fighting because they're ordered to. Uh, you know, Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of this continent, it was not a pacifist continent. It was full of warfare, and there was conquest. There was all, but there was medicine in the war making. I mean, they would have extensive ceremonies to, in some tribes, to create the arrows that they would shoot, right? And they would take time down by the river to like infuse the their arsenal with spiritual power, and without that, they considered themselves helpless and useless. Their entire reason for fighting had something to do with being connected to something larger, which was connected to their people, which was connected to the land, right? So, knowing why you're fighting, by definition, if you know why you're fighting, you're connected to something bigger than you. And in the case of political activism, which isn't necessarily about going and making war to conquer territory or this and that, but to change a system, well, you have to have a pretty strong vision in mind of what it is we want. What do we want to? You may not be able to answer exactly what political system are we going to replace it with. Um, you can understand, though. I can understand certainly some maybe impatience on someone's part, being um, like, we don't have time to craft a full vision of how it's supposed. We just need to end this now. This just
yeah,
needs to end. We don't care what comes next.
yeah.
I
I
can
mean,
imagine that.
yeah, and I think that's true, and I think I feel that in my body as well. And the reality is that even if I see that, that's just not happening.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, I can say that and I can feel that and that can be true, but it's still not happening. So then what? What does that leave me with?
Yeah.
That this should end. Like, yeah, of course it should end, and it's not ending, right? So now I'm stuck. So it's
Yeah.
like I could just cling on to that way of thinking, um, but it doesn't feel like it's getting those results. Or
Mm.
maybe if I stay dedicated enough, maybe one day it will.
Hmm.
You know, for me, part of this relationship between spirituality and politics is again not to say like this is the way it should be, that but it is like this study of like what are we doing and is it working. And I think that a lot of times in the political world we get so scared to say actually what we were doing didn't work. Maybe we need a different plan, maybe we need a different, and also understanding that every human has multiple sides and parts of them. Just because I'm committed to certain political vision doesn't mean I'm not going to have so many different thoughts and feelings about them. Of course I will.
Right.
I'm a dynamic, alive human, and I think any political movement needs to make space for the ways in which humans are alive and not just objects that are now signing on for a thing.
Yeah.
And this is where I think sometimes political discourse can get very flattened, where it's just like, yes, no. Do you believe this? No. Did you say this language? Did you not say this
Yeah.
language? Right? Which can be sometimes useful, but if we're not honoring everybody's aliveness and understand and like permissioning actually people's aliveness, this is again for me part of this way in which ultimately what is justice about is to protect life and life of all beings, and to understand the ways in which certain people have been dehumanized so that their lives don't seem as important as other people's lives. So the fight for justice is also just a fight for life, and that is also how I view my spirituality, is that actually I, as a human, part of my role in this planet, this wild planet, is to learn how to protect life and protect life from within myself and outside of myself and cherish it and allow things to grow, learn about what it takes for life to grow. I mean, and this is where it's just to become like what we are as humans, like we're connecting, we're constantly creating and growth process, whether it's like making babies or like birthing projects. But to me, I think we're so wired for growth, and this continuation of life. And I think that injustice is where, right, that there's a rupture actually
Mm.
in this protection of life. Um, yeah.
And I think someone was asking in the chat, like, can you define spirituality? Which I think you did. But then, like, kind of what are the advantages? Like, it's one thing to say, yeah, long term, we're going to create a better vision of what we want and it'll be more aligned. But, like, in terms of results people can see and feel, like, that's honestly how I get sold on things, not because it's true, but because it's helpful.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, and I'd like to think that I'm living in a universe where truth is helpful. But I resonate with this question of like, what are the advantages? So one place where I can imagine it being advantageous to someone who wants to be involved in politics to maintain some kind of spiritual view, whatever that is. We're not talking about religious practice here. We're not talking about converting anyone to any belief system, but tapping into those larger than human parts of their consciousness, uh, would be something like mental health
Yeah,
or resilience, which is a word we often hear in politics. And Palestinians, what do they pride themselves on their most? What's their national characteristic that is like, I mean, it's kind of truly remarkable, but this Arabic word samud, which means steadfastness, which is some kind of combination of faithfulness and patience and stick to itiveness and yeah, just faith. Well, I'm not trying to flatten every Palestinian and say all Palestinians are religious, but certainly some kind of spiritual inclination towards life would be required to maintain that kind of
yeah,
resilient hopefulness and determination in the face of no hope. So
totally.
for activists over here or wherever people are listening, can you can you speak to like how what's the connection between resilience and not not spiritual beliefs? Because I don't think you're talking about beliefs. You're talking about a spiritual dimension to consciousness,
Hmm.
a spirit, almost like a skill of perception. Like if I'm understanding you right, like the capacity to, at the same time as we see the fucked upness of the world, we see the perfection of things. At the
Mhm.
same time as we feel our emotions, we hold it in a larger container. So yeah, can you talk about resilience and what that has to do with
Well,
spirituality?
first, just to reiterate your point, I think if you study, and I'm not going to say all because I haven't studied all, but most decolonial struggles across the world, uh, most of the time their leaders were deeply spiritual. Especially if you study this. I think there was a study, I forgot where it was, someone sent it to me, but looking at decolonial struggles and spiritual teachers, spiritual traditions. Um, yeah, it's like in terms of the movements that were successful, they had a very strong spiritual ground, spiritual anchor, spiritual truth teller. And I think, I actually did a podcast on this with my friend Ala, who's very, very learned about all of this and speaks so beautifully. But just around how, colonization, one of the first groups of people that colonization targets is spiritual teachers. Because if people don't have spiritual teachers to orient to, they lose their capacity to organize, to be together, to learn something. So you can see the ways in which spiritual teachers have just consistently been targeted by
Yeah.
colonization and empire as kind of proof to the level of threat actually that spiritual teachings provide.
And also, by the way, sorry to just cut in, but it often happens to be that spiritual leaders in colonized areas happen to be the ones doing the on the ground work. So in Latin America, who were the US backed militias murdering? It was Catholic priests
Yeah,
and nuns because they were the ones doing the dangerous work with the poor.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's something in the Western kind of mindset around spirituality that's been very, in some ways it's like this is kind of classic the West, like let's just extract wisdom as much as we can from other traditions and then not share the full context of it. But I think that's kind of what's happened to a lot of spiritual teachings as well, is that there's kind of this extraction of like love and light and then let go of the rest of the depth of those teachings.
The grit. Yeah.
Yeah, which is part of why I really like studying spiritual traditions from a lot of other places in the world that are not just America.
Yeah.
Because America, right? You know this, you helped write a book about this, but just like the toxicity of the culture and the way that we talk about certain things is just very palpable here. Um, but anyways, just to go back to your question about the practicalities of it. So one thing for me is about how, because it's really easy to look at the world as it is right now and to say, you know what, fuck it. Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to plug in. I don't know, like maybe kind of entering that more helpless place. Or you could say also waiting for something to shift, right? Waiting for that policy to change, well, waiting for that thing to be enough. And I think part of what spirituality offers is this place of saying, you know what, I'm actually not going to wait for anyone. I'm not going to wait for anything to change. I'm not going to wait for anyone to do anything. I'm actually just going to use my life force and learn how to navigate that in the most, I don't know, like use that as a learning kit study that is just about me and my life force, and learn how I can show up to this world, to myself, to each other through that. And, this is part of like the teachings of Jesus, who was, so many people were like, oh, and you have that in Judaism as well, of like the kind of way in which sometimes people think that they need so much to enter spiritual teachings. Like, I need to have this education, or I need to know this word, or I need to know this language or that thing. But actually, all you need is yourself and your life force. And I think that's why spirituality feels like the most democratic thing possible, right? Because you can literally be anywhere, and people have, whether it's in the desert or in prisons or the airplane, like, and spirituality is still accessible to you. Like, there's something so fundamentally beautiful and I call it God again, but like that wherever you are, whoever you are, if you are connected to your own breath, God is available to you. You
Yeah.
know, that's something that's so mind-boggling. But I will say that it's, you know, it's part of like learning how to, because I think, and this is where I see the similarities of political spiritual work, which is they're both in some ways questioning why we are the way that we are, or
Mm,
questioning our conditioning, or
mm.
questioning what it is that we inherited, you know, or questioning the like lies, the deception, the this, the that. Is this really true? You know, I was
Yeah,
taught
the
this,
illusion. Yeah,
the illusion,
they're both
right?
about they're both about waking up.
Yeah, and I think that there's something about understanding that if you do nothing in this world, your body is going to be conditioned into something. Because whether it's like the media you watch, the place you like you, these forces are working on you with your consent or without your consent. And to me, spirituality is a bit of a buffer to say, you know what? Until here. Like you're not actually going to come into my heart. You're not going to come into my inner domain. I actually have agency over it. And it's really, you know, sounds okay, sure, but it's really actually hard when you're like, you know what? I'm going to stop or exert a boundary from these outside systems working on my psyche, on my mind, on my emotions.
Yeah,
And I'm going to create more of a space so that I can choose and work with my own system, so then I'm not just in response to this constant external system, but I'm also actually emanating. Like a teacher said this to me once. Actually, Ethan, our mutual teacher, said this to me once, right? Because it was a, you know, I'm quite sensitive, but I used to be really, really sensitive. Is that when I would sometimes go into different rooms or different, you know, events, and sometimes if the energy was harsh, it would just really affect my system. And he was just like, okay, part of your spiritual training, your spiritual practice is around how do you walk into these spaces, and instead of letting the energy affect you and morph you, how can you actually, through your presence, just create that field or that ripple effect, that things aren't happening to you, but you're actually emanating
yeah.
out.
And
uh,
I imagine that takes practice.
oh yeah, takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of like, how do I relate to my own life force? How do I relate to my own
Mm.
soul? You know, this very deep inner work, which is why spiritual practice is really, really hard. It's not
Yeah.
easy.
See, now when you put it as how do I relate to my own life force, I instantly get more interested in it than when I hear the words like it's time to do spiritual work, spiritual practice,
Did I?
spirituality, because it could mean so many different things. But this question of how do I relate to my own life force is bound up with whether or not I'm going to live a creatively fulfilling life, whether or not I'm going to be emotionally, mentally, and physically well, how my relationships are going to be, if I'm going to be satisfied with the things I'm doing, you know, and to be quite, no, I won't be super candid, but to be a little,
Candid.
what's that?
You can be super candid.
I don't want to though, because I don't want to actually. But I'm actually trying to keep a bit of a boundary up. I haven't done one of these lives in a long, long, long time, and I used to be doing them all the time. This time last year, you know, just before I met you,
Yeah.
like, and even into this year, and at that time, I was really getting off on, and when I say getting off, I don't mean it in the crude sense, but I was getting a rush of pleasure and excitement and fulfillment from the fact that I was emanating something into the world, and people were tuning in and they wanted it, and it was helping them, and it felt like the timing was right because we were in a tough moment and there's all these terrible things going on. But it turns out I didn't have the spiritual skills, and I still don't actually. I'm starting from scratch to keep that channel open,
Hmm.
but also be discerning about what I let in,
Yeah.
to keep that channel open, but be discerning about how much I let out and how much I have to reserve for myself. That there's parts of me that will just use that to feed unquenchable thirsts for attention, for validation, for this and that, you know. And since joining the podcast with Matt, it's become a real. I've been preferring that because it's contained
Yeah.
and because it's usually not live. It's just us. I'm not
You don't get people chatting like capos, Nazis.
Or on the other hand, oh my God, we thank you so much for what you're doing. I mean, we do get praise and thanks, but there's more of a buffer.
Yeah.
And it's not right or wrong or good or bad, but it is a lack of spiritual skillfulness on my part, in a sense, or just a kind of um, yeah, lack of capacity that it just burned me out,
Yeah.
and I lost my taste for it utterly and completely. And I've got a voice in my head being like, "What are you doing for Palestine?" I'm like, "Well, I'm still doing the podcast, but I mean, so and social media I think is designed in many ways to it, there's it's not like there's a feature on Instagram that will be like, we noticed you've been posting a lot today. Are you taking care of yourself? Like, are you remembering that this too shall pass and that this is not about you? Like, no, Instagram wants you to just create more and more and more and more. That's how the algorithms work. And if some people can do that, great. But I haven't. I've found it to be really.
Yeah.
I don't have it right now. Um, and it stops it stops feeling genuine,
Mhm.
and it stops feeling like it's coming from my life force and it's feeding my life force. It's like sucking my life force. And
Yeah.
I think that there's probably a lot of people doing much more overtly political work, like organizing, who, if they don't know how to do it right, they're going to just have their life force sucked and burn out like a workaholic will.
Yeah. Right. And then it's kind of become this contradictory thing where it's like, oh, we're trying to protect life, but where is our life? Like, and I think that's part
Yeah.
of, for me, that constant dilemma, actually. Um,
So you train people in this. Speaking of skill building.
yeah, well, just one thing also to say, because you said it's like a lack of like spiritual skills on my part or something you said like that. And I guess I just want to reframe that a bit if I can. Because I
Oh,
find it.
you're going to tell me to be nicer to myself?
No, I mean, you can treat yourself however you want to. I think it's more just this notion that I hear a lot from people, especially people who kind of come to my class. They're like, "Oh, I'm not spiritual enough for this. This is spiritual," like this way of feeling like, "Oh, I don't know how to do that. That's too hard for me." And I think part of what I really want to break down for people is that like truly spirituality is not a destination, right? And we have this kind of commentary in Judaism that's like the higher spiritual wisdom you get, the harder it is to maintain it actually, because you're gonna so the challenge is always there, and that's why spirituality is not about attaining something, but actually about this practice. I think that's part of what I love about like God Fellowship, which is the program I offer, or like Malchut, the school I've been building, is I've been really trying to build it around practice of like life is hard, being with ourselves is hard, being with this world is hard, like just really admitting it to ourselves instead of just dancing around the streets and pretending like everything is beautiful. And it is beautiful on some level, but there's also a lot of hardship that we just don't acknowledge that is not going to change unless we actually try, unless we actually practice. um, so anyways, I just want to really give a big kind of platform for spiritual practice, that it's not about, oh, I am this, I'm not that, because we actually don't know who we are. To say I am this or I'm not that, like actually nobody knows, right?
To be
We all,
clear, all I was saying was I'm not spiritually practiced enough. I wasn't
yeah,
at the
yeah, yeah.
time that
Yes,
things were popping off spiritually practiced enough. I didn't have enough of the strong muscle there to
yeah,
maintain a view that allowed me to make conscious choices. And
yeah,
I fell into overwhelm and burnout, which are, you know, very familiar to me. So yes, practice.
yeah.
So I want to hear more from you about what that practice looks like and what it is that you offer and what you've got coming up. I'd like to take a quick bathroom break before we get into that.
Okay.
Is that cool? Do you want to just take some questions or
Yeah,
just
yeah,
hang out
I'll
with the
take some
people? I'll be right back.
questions. Yeah, you can go to the bathroom. Okay, wow. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I'll read some of your questions. It's so nice to see so many different people on here. Yeah, if you have thoughts or questions for us, if we kind of wrap it up, feel welcome to say in the chat. Tell us what resonated or didn't resonate. that's also permissible to share. Um, I see someone talking about Haq, a name of God, truth. Yes, I know, I love that name of God. Um, I'm just scrolling up to see what people have been writing. It does get quite overwhelming sometimes doing a live and all of this comments everywhere. Um, okay, we got Chicago Bund, the Jewish Labor Bund. Cool. I will let Daniel know as he comes on. How do we introduce spirituality to our kids? Actually, it's interesting. There's this program I offer is called God Fellowship. It starts at the end of January, like a 12-week training for um, people who want to cultivate a relationship with God or really cultivate a relationship with a life force. And the first person that I had sign up was actually a parent who came and asked about spirituality and kids and how to pass on. So yeah, if you want to connect, it looks like some of the teachings will be geared towards that. You're welcome to message me privately. We can chat about it. Yes.
This is a good one, this last one.
Which
How do
one?
you feel about many people who feel and say they are spiritual, but they don't want to look at what's going on? I assume meaning in the world, right? And don't want to, quote, lower their frequencies.
Where do you see this
Feather
question?
love. It's the last question that I see in the feed.
I don't see it. Say it again.
Basically about spiritual woo-woo people who say they're spiritual, but they don't want to lower their
Hmm.
field by looking at the shit in the world.
Yeah. Well, this is part of this, and this gets complex because just because someone says something doesn't mean it's true, right? And I think we oftentimes just fall, it's like, oh, this person said that this. But part of it is a practice of learning how to train, whether it's our spiritual eye or our ears, to actually find truth, right? Because if I'm actually connected to truth and someone comes and says something that sounds good but is not actually embodied truth, I will immediately feel that. I'm not going to be deceived by it. That's part of actually the rewards of spiritual practice, is that it also gives you a deeper insight into what's actually, when you're relating to people, to actually feel on a deeper level like where that person is coming from.
Yeah, I guess that was the thrust in a way of my whole Brene Brown video that I made,
Yeah.
which was, I still can't believe I did that. I sort of went after the one of the biggest fish in the spiritual personal development world and was like, I don't believe what you're saying.
Yeah.
But that was just the feeling I had. I read it and I was just like, this just doesn't ring true. And then of course, anyone at any time could make a similar video about me. I'm just as capable of delusion and hypocrisy as anyone else. But she just happened to have this huge platform, and yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, well, I think we all are in some ways susceptible to it. That's why truth can't be oriented to like one person, right? This is why religion centers around God, which is bigger than any one person. Because if we orient, I mean, this is where there's so much of that concept of idol worship or whatever. But if we orient it just, this people has the truth and I should just follow this person and what they say, then it's like, well, what if they make a mistake? Are we going to take that as the word of God?
mhm.
And I think when we, part of, for me, the training is like learning how to find God in our own ways, in our own rhythm, in our own, so that we can recognize it. Not that we go through a filter, and just take that. Um, yeah. I
Mm.
see that person that was like, said that we didn't, wow, there's so many things happening. Um, that person was like, you didn't answer the question. Can you ask it again? Because I don't see it. Um, do, do, do. Oh, I have someone from my Torah study class. I do weekly Hebrew Bible classes. Um, excellent retelling of source of creation story is Star Trek. tracking season 3, episode 16, The Offspring. Yeah, we've
Great
been talking about.
episode where Data creates a daughter. It's a beautiful episode. Data, the android. That's a
I've
great show.
never watched Star Trek, but people keep telling me it's very biblical.
It's got bits of aspects. It's malchut.one, right? I'm just going to put this in the chat.
Yeah. Maté is my. Um. Anyways, wow, a lot of comments are coming. I think maybe we're closing it up. I don't know if there's, but I just will say that if folks are interested in um, being in spiritual practice together, there's a couple offerings that you can look at malchut.one. I have a 3-week course called A Glimpse of God that's really oriented around what is it like to glimpse God, to like have an experience, to have a texture, a feeling. And yeah, it will be with people who want to be in spiritual practice and community together. It's a 3-week course. It's sliding scale. If finances are ever an issue, you can always talk to me. And then God Fellowship is coming up at the end of January, which is a 12-week course. It's kind of a more in-depth community space where people really go through deep transformation together. And it's my favorite thing that I offer to the world. So yeah, if any of those things are, if you're curious about any of these things, please be welcome to reach out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question that the person doesn't feel has been answered is, how do you feel about those people? I'm not sure what kind of answer you're looking for. Those people are annoying. Those people are unfortunate. Those people are silly. Or do you feel some compassion for them? Um,
Well,
Sort of
I
privileged
yeah.
spiritual people who are using spirituality to escape from um, the troubles of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are, I mean, how I think I feel that they're heavily misunderstanding spirituality, which I think was another question we got is about, because so often spirituality is sold as something that is separate from the world. Like, come experience spirituality and don't look at these other horrific things that
Right.
are happening and feel good about the work that you do.
Right.
And I think for me, spirituality is really about how do we be present with what is exactly in the way that it is, whether it's, it could be anything, right? But it's about developing this presence and not staying attached to any, oh, it needs to be, but like, yeah, this way that is again connected to this aliveness, to the dynamic presence of reality.
Yeah.
And I think that, as you were talking about Brene Brown or all these other kind of people that we have in the psychology or spiritual or healing world, right? We see this a lot of this saying one thing and then, I mean, especially with Palestine, it being too hard to look at, or maybe not even too hard. Maybe they just don't want to. Maybe it questions some of their like structural ways that they've built their understanding of themselves or understanding of the world. And yeah, I guess I would like, for me, what I see when I see that, I mean, and again, it depends on the person, but what I see is a lot of fear.
Mm.
I think that a lot of people like that actually, even if they're teaching all about this stuff about spiritual liberation, I actually sense a lot of fear in their system. Because if they're just scared to even just say the word Palestine, like that's actually a lot of fear, let alone acknowledge a genocide that is ongoing. So I think
Yeah.
that turning away is almost pointing to like a lack of capacity to be with that, not knowing maybe what to say, shutting down, and then being too scared, maybe because of the consequences of speaking up or all of that. And for me, spirituality is in some way this constant reckoning with fear.
Mm.
So it becomes confusing, right? When a spiritual teacher actually is saying these things, but then there's so much fear. But also, just to say that I also struggle with fear in my system. It's not something that's like, oh, they're scared. Like we all have these dimensions within us. And I think, again, that's why spiritual community for me feels so important and part of what I've been trying to build, as not as a way to like shame us for having these different parts of us, but to be able to practice being in community together, practicing different skills, growing ourselves, sharing of ourselves, like this feels so fundamental. And I think something that I just love about malchut is that it is a community. Like that's, I feel like the thing that I really find so much joy in, right? Because it's one thing for me to just give teachings and then it's there and then halas, like, cool, whoever got it, whoever's practicing is practicing. But it's another when you're like, okay, as a community, we're going to try to do these things.
Yeah.
We're going to
Well,
try.
then speaking of that, there was I think a sort of a logistical, well, not just logistical, but a question of who belongs to that community that someone asked that's important to get you to answer. Is malchut, which is a Hebrew word, just a school for people following the Jewish tradition, the Jewish
No,
Bible, the Hebrew,
yeah,
spiritual tradition? A glimpse of God? Are you looking at it, you know, explicitly
yeah,
through a Jewish lens? And how do you, because there is content in your school that's about the Jewish mystical tradition.
yeah. Yeah, malchut has two, and by the way, malchut also comes from Arabic, so it's not just Hebrew,
Right.
Semitic languages. But yeah, it's actually named after my grandma, Malka. So it's my ancestral lineage prayer continuation. Um, but it has two main offerings. One is centered around God fellowship, which is the main fellowship, which is really for anyone who wants to have a personal relationship to God and um, being a immersive 12-week training around that. I mean, we meet once a week for 90 minutes, but there's a lot of practices. There's a lot of a lot of very deep work that happens together. I've been teaching it for a few years and yeah, excited to teach it again. And then A Glimpse of God is a 3-week course that is in some ways glimpsing um, that. So it's a kind of an introduction to the overall spiritual framework. And all of that is open to people of all faith. One of the things that I also love is just how multi-religious um, the community can be in the different. Someone reminded me earlier in the class I taught today about how I said this line. I forgot where I said it, but God is one, but the path to God is multitude. There's and that's something that I firmly believe, right? Definitely in the oneness of God, but also in the multiplicity of pathways.
Mm-hmm.
So I very much honor that. The other part of Malchut is the membership-based Jewish mystical school, which is also open to people of all faith. I have Muslims, Christians, like people who are really interested in learning more about Judaism. And yeah, there are classes about the particular tradition of Judaism, but so much of my work is also about transforming Jewish tradition to not be about apartheid and segregation and we're the chosen people, let's boundary out the rest of the world, but actually Judaism as being a portal of connection
Yeah.
to their people and to this world. So yeah, everybody who's interested is welcome to join. And I also love, like, especially people who come speaking different languages and, because the Bible has been translated to so many different languages. So it's always so interesting looking at the etymology of certain words. I mean, yeah, that's the scriptural class, which is more kind of in-depth scripture, but the God Fellowship is very much geared towards practices, meditation, community. Yeah.
Beautiful. So people can find that at your website, malchut.one. That's malchut.one.
Yeah.
And follow Hadar and follow the school if you don't
Thanks.
already.
Yeah, I'm setting up my Instagram too, Malchut School.
Beautiful.
Is there anything you want to share about, as we're kind of coming to a close, about this conversation?
No, I'm just in an active or passive whatever inquiry about where my life force wants to be
Mm-hmm.
next,
Yeah.
and I do know that when I was super active on Instagram, I was really feeling it. It was really giving me a sense of purpose and life and all that. And if I don't feel that, it's hard for me to do the thing,
Yeah.
you know? And so I'm just trying to inquire into, well, Yeah, I'm just on my own. Uh, uh, I'm navigating my own life force trajectory right now.
Yeah,
So I find that I don't have that much to say. I I keep having to assure myself that that's okay, that it's all right to go through periods where you just don't have so much to say.
yeah.
I
Well,
mean, certainly for all the good I've done or you've done or any of us have done, we have not made the difference we say we want to make when we say free Palestine. We haven't, not even close.
yeah,
It feels farther away now in some ways than it did a year ago. Um, and we were at an event last night, you and me, with Rashid Khalidi was there, and he was speaking about sort of how Samud is made of a kind of very real long-term vision, and I guess that for me, having the patience with myself to ask, okay, I served a function for a certain amount of time in a certain role, and then that role kind of shifted, and now I'm waiting to see what the next one is, and trusting that something will come. And
yeah,
it may be less public than before, or it may be a comeback of the century. I don't know, but for now, I'm still doing the podcast.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I hear you about all of that. I think that's really real. I mean, and one thing I was going to say earlier about especially the changing of seasons and stuff, like it's kind of impossible for any human to just be output, output, output all the time, right? We need also this reflection space or this like pause moment to replenish so that we can give. And I think part of this like output, 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 output is part of it is connected to kind of this capitalistic extractive mentality that just doesn't honor that the body needs sometimes to replenish itself or the psyche needs to replenish itself and
Yeah,
yeah that's just as important as the other parts, you know.
for sure.
Well, thank you for doing this live with me. This was a great time. um, we'll put it up on YouTube, I guess, as well if people want to listen. um, just reading some of these things. Any parting things you want to say, Daniel?
That was it.
Okay.
You get the last word.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Yeah, and just to say that this, you know, I feel like we just kind of started glimpsing at certain things here, and this is such an ongoing conversation. Yeah, and curious to hear your thoughts as well. Feel welcome to comment or to reach out. This is really something I've been thinking about for a long time, especially around this connection between spirituality and politics, or this connection of like self work and outer work, and just the balance of it all, and the weaving of all these different places. And yeah, with this question of like, what will it take to protect life? You know, what will it take to protect our own life, each other's lives, this world? You know, who do we need to be to have that um, in this world? Yeah,
Beautiful. And I can definitely recommend Hadar's teachings to people. I mean, I haven't been a long time student or a very faithful student in many ways because we have a, personal relationship that is my main way of knowing you. But I've sat in on some of your classes. I've taught with you. I've listened to many of your webinars and your podcasts. And when you talk about uh, God and spirituality, much more than your average spiritual teacher, I get a glimpse of what you're pointing to,
mm.
and I think that's a real skill. So I
Well,
think anyone,
glimpse
and
of God.
exactly. So anyone out there who's curious about this stuff, but maybe a little skeptical, you'd be in good hands with Hadar.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, that's really lovely. And I will say, because we did actually have this question I forgot to address about, and that's maybe a whole other conversation at another time about this word secular and what it means to be secular and what it means to be spiritual and atheist. But I've had people who are atheists come to my classes about God, and it's been really beautiful actually. Because ultimately it's not about a belief system, it's about a practice and a way of life. So yeah. All right, folks, that is all for now. Goodbye.